the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello everybody, we are live today in San Francisco in my home studio with an iconic American writer, J. Malcolm Garcia. He's won all sorts of awards, including the Studs Terkel Award for reporting on real life. He has a novel out in the Rain, a novel about homeless people in, of all places, San Francisco. Malcolm, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Why write a novel about homeless people, given that your expertise is in factual reporting?
A novel gives you an opportunity to really get inside an individual's head. It also allowed me to put some of the experiences I had had as a social services worker into stories that I wasn't able to do when I wrote essays or did other forms of nonfiction.
How extensive, in your view, you've spent a lot of time on the street in San Francisco and elsewhere, you're based in San Diego. How I use this word carefully, Malcolm, how existential is the crisis of homelessness? That's a word that gets used, perhaps overused, with all sorts of problems. But is it an existential crisis, at least in California and other major American cities?
Well, it's certainly very serious. And I think it's so serious that it's almost impossible to deal with on the local level. I think it's gotten so out of hand, and I don't say that because I'm being critical of homeless people, but just the numbers of people who can't afford to live in a home. It's gotten so bad. I think we need the equivalent of what we did after World War II with the Marshall Plan, where the federal government just has to get seriously involved in creating affordable homes. In San Diego, where I live, I was just telling a friend of mine that a one-bedroom apartment goes for $3,000 a month. The average, according to realtors, you need to be earning close to $300,000 a year and be willing to spend $1 million on a house to own a property in San Diego. And I'm sure the equivalent is true in San Francisco. And that's just it's outrageous, and it's out of bounds of certainly anybody that I know.
Malcolm, whenever I hear the term Marshall Plan, I have to admit I'm always a bit skeptical, because there was only one Marshall Plan, right, and that was a unique moment in American and world history. Is that your way of suggesting that this deeply rooted problem isn't going to be addressed?
Well, it certainly isn't being addressed in any serious fashion now, and I think we are in a unique moment in history here, because certainly when I was in social services, when we talked about housing, we were talking primarily of poor people. But now we're in a situation where it's poor people, it's people with homes who can't leave their homes because they couldn't afford to buy a new one. It's college graduates who have to move in with their parents and stay there for years because they can't afford a home. So it's gotten quite huge, and nobody on the political scene, as far as I'm concerned, is taking it as seriously as they should.
You mentioned the $3,000 rents in San Diego. I think the rents in San Francisco are even higher. Is this then a problem essentially with the market? Is it one of the more unpalatable consequences of neoliberalism?
I think that's part of it. I think it's also just it's partially that, and it's also just a need to develop more housing, and there's certain resistance to that. There's certainly a lot of people who will have their Black Lives Matter signs and that sort of thing in their yards, but they'll oppose any housing development in their neighborhood. So part of it's an economic issue, and part of it is really sort of a moral issue. I'm all for it as long as you don't put it in my neighborhood.
There's a word for that, of course, NIMBY, not in my backyard. A lot of people have written articles and indeed even books on NIMBYism, particularly in wealthy liberal cities like San Francisco. There was a book written, I'm sure you're familiar with it, in San Francisco called San Francisco.
Right.
Is this, and that book suggested that the problem lay, when it comes to homelessness, lay on the left rather than amongst conservatives. Is there any truth to that, Malcolm, or is that just a convenient political way of simply avoiding the subject?
Well, I think, everybody needs to shoulder responsibility. There's the NIMBYism, there's the dismissal of poor people as, if they really didn't want to be poor, they wouldn't be poor, they'd work harder, et cetera, et cetera. So I think both sides have played off a large group of people that they don't see as really a political threat to them. They don't have to appeal to homeless people to stay in power, to run for office or whatever. So it's often dealt with as a nuisance problem rather than the serious problem that it is.
One of the great issues, and we've had shows specifically on this, is the role of mental illness and drugs and alcohol addiction in homelessness. What's your read of that? Is that the central reason why many people are indeed homeless? You've suggested that the cost of rent is also a factor, but what proportion of San Francisco or San Diego's homeless population are suffering mental illness of one kind or another?
Well, I think there's a significant portion that's suffering from addiction as well as mental health issues, and a combination of the two. And it also becomes a chicken or the egg sort of thing. Which came first? Did somebody lose their job, lose their housing, start drinking, or start having emotional problems as a consequence of that? Or were they always suffering from these issues, and that just further propelled them onto the street? What we do know is that whatever the problem, people recover much faster if they're housed. Even if an alcoholic is still drinking, getting them in housing with supportive services, you'll have a far better outcome than trying to treat somebody. They go to a program, halfway houses are full, so then they have to go back to the homeless shelter, and they're on the street trying to stay sober or trying to maintain the medication for mental health issues while something opens up.
There is also a narrative, and I'm sure you're all too familiar with this, that some homeless people want to be homeless. They choose to be homeless. They don't want to be housed, certainly not housed by the local authority. Is there any truth to that?
I don't think so. I think you have to dig deep. If somebody says, I'd rather be outside, then you have to ask the question, why would they rather be outside? What has happened to this individual that they'd rather be outside? I think it's far too simplistic to say some people who just want to be outside. If they say they want to be outside, there's a reason, and it's most likely a very traumatic reason that they're staying out on the street. It's not just simply, I prefer it here, I'm the happy hobo, leave me alone. You have to dig when somebody says something like that. I don't accept that at face value.
Your last book, this new book, Out in the Rain, is a novel. What can a novelist do when it comes to describing homelessness that a non-fiction writer, and you wear that cap too, can't do? What does writing fiction bring you or bring to the reader about the tragedy of homelessness, the crisis of homelessness, that a non-fiction writer isn't able to do?
Well, I think they both are doing it. They're just going at it from different angles. A non-fiction writer is focusing on facts as presented to them, and a fiction writer is taking experiences of people and molding a narrative to make a certain point through their imagination, also through the research they apply to the story they're telling.
Tell me about the book, Malcolm. Who are the characters in it, in Out of the Rain?
Well, there's a character, Tom, who runs a nonprofit agency that serves homeless people. There's a character named Walter, who is one of the people who accesses the agency. Then there are the staff people who had been homeless, who are now working for the agency, trying to bring in people they knew on the street and help them get off the street. And each chapter is dealing with the daily dramas and trials of their lives, both the people who got off the street and are working in the shelter and are struggling very hard not to end up back on the street, and the people like Walter, who is trying to get off the street but sometimes gets pulled back because of his addictions.
How much direct research did you do or have you done for this book?
Well, I worked with homeless people for 14 years in San Francisco, and I continue to volunteer with agencies that assist homeless people. So I based a lot of it on the experiences of those years and of that work and of people I knew. It's not autobiographical, but it's certainly some of the characters, certain traits, certain characteristics are based on people I knew.
How has everything changed, Malcolm, over the last 14 years when it comes to homelessness in San Francisco? Most residents complain all the time about it, but they haven't your professional eye. How more serious is this crisis when you go down to the Tenderloin or other parts of downtown San Francisco?
You know, just to my eye, it's much more serious. I mean, you just see many more people than I saw when I was in San Francisco. I've been in San Diego since 2018, and just in, 6 years, I'm seeing many more people on the street than I saw in 2018. So just the initial reaction is just the volume of people who are out there. And the increasing number of people now that I'm seeing anyways who have jobs and are sleeping in their cars and then going to work and then coming back and having to stay in their cars because they can't afford rents. They're working, but they can't afford rent.
There's a narrative also that cities like San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles have become magnets for homelessness, that it's much harder to be homeless in smaller towns, perhaps a place like Sacramento or Bakersfield. Is there any truth to that, or certainly East Coast towns too?
Again, I think it's similar to the question: do people want to be on the street? I don't think people are coming to San Francisco or San Diego, to be homeless and just to live off, live off welfare. The benefits are not that generous. The city is very expensive. Even though there are many services, it's still a hostile place to live. People don't, want them on the street. Police don't want them on the street. It's not an easy living. So it's not as if this is becoming sort of the retirement destination for homeless people. It's tough, and most of the people that I've met who are homeless are from, when I worked in San Francisco and again in San Diego, were from the area. They weren't, coming from Pennsylvania or Texas or something like that.
What do you make, Malcolm, of some of the legal cases going through the system, particularly the one that I think the Supreme Court is addressing, of whether cities or states have the right to I don't know what the right word is, to relocate, to find a euphemism, homeless people?
Well, I think without leadership, people just get frustrated, and so they just want the problem to go away. And again, because homeless people aren't a political constituency, they're fairly easy to scapegoat and discard. So it's very convenient to simply say you can't sleep in parks anymore, you have to go. And it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind mentality. But they're going to go somewhere, and they're going to be seen somewhere, and their health and their situation will continue to deteriorate, and the places they go to won't want them either. So eventually it's going to catch up to us. I don't blame business owners and people in residential areas who object to having somebody, sleep in their doorway when they want to open their business or when they get up to go to work in the morning. Obviously that's frustrating, but without political leadership, people are left to their own devices, and I think people just say, I want the problem gone, and we sort of lose our humanity. We get frustrated and we just say, I want it out of here. If it's out of my neighborhood, I'm okay. Wherever they go, that's fine. Get them out of here.
Are there politicians, Malcolm, that you admire? Gavin Newsom's conceivable that he might run even for president if Joe Biden retires. He's the governor of the state, all too familiar with the problem of homelessness. Are some politicians doing a better job, or are they all pretty useless?
You know, I think I don't believe that all politicians are bad, and I certainly think there are people who are making an effort. It's a huge problem, and I don't think any one person is highlighting the problem and really leading a charge on saying, let's get this done. It seems to me that it's people respond to the citizens' frustrations, and then there's a patchwork of we're going to have some funding and block grants and this and that and the other. There isn't a passion to address the issue because it's a very difficult one, and it does require funding. And I think people are just scared of it. And because homeless people, again, aren't a constituency, it's easy not to deal with it in the way it should be dealt with, but deal with it in a piecemeal manner to just sort of calm people down and get it out of the way so it's not a political distraction.
They may not be a constituency, they may not vote, but the people of San Francisco can vote, and many of them feel strongly about it. What's your sense of what local residents want when it comes to homelessness? They just want these people off the street?
I think they do. I mean, I think they want them off the street. I think they're compassionate. I don't think people are just saying, I don't care. But they don't know what to do. You know, you see somebody, you know, again, asleep in front of your store. You just want to get on with your life. And it just seems like you can't because nothing is happening. I think if someone came forward and said, here's a real concrete plan, but it might require taxes or funding or what have you, I think people would get behind it, but they're not seeing results. You'll see a building converted into 100 units or something, but there's nothing really big that is attempting to address the problem. It's very piecemeal, and I think people are frustrated.
The political winds, Malcolm, are changing dramatically in America. You don't need me to tell you this. We have the rise of right-wing post-liberalism, which has more faith in the state and is actually rather skeptical of the market. Men like J.D. Vance, who may be the next vice president of the United States. Is it conceivable that it will be conservatives who address this problem most rigorously and aggressively rather than liberals?
It's conceivable, but we don't know yet what their plan is other than tent cities. But tent cities, unless you have an exit plan for housing, that becomes a bottleneck like so many other situations. So they've talked a lot, Trump certainly has, about tent cities and clearing the streets, and then from tent cities somehow people are going to magically go someplace else, but we don't know where that someplace else is.
Perhaps we should send Malcolm to Mar-a-Lago.
There'd be plenty of rooms there, that's for sure.
What about tech? San Francisco, of course, is the home of Silicon Valley, or the urban home of Silicon Valley. Many tech people, from Elon Musk to Peter Thiel, have expressed very strong feelings on homelessness. There's an increasing pro-Trump faction now within Silicon Valley. Can technology be a fix here? I mean, I'm not sure how AI could be used, but there are many tech leaders, Mark Benioff, for example, at Salesforce, who have the tallest building in downtown San Francisco, who have been very vocal and outspoken about the problems, the crisis of homelessness.
I think they could provide the impetus for perhaps housing or some kind of collective effort to really address the problem seriously, to put pressure on the politicians they support to really look at this as seriously as the other issues that they are happy to address, like tax cuts and that sort of thing. I think they could certainly apply the pressure to do that, but again, what they really want, they haven't articulated.
Perhaps because they can't, because it would be too painful or too problematic.
Right, for the person they support.
You mentioned earlier that we need a Marshall Plan. If I was to give you magical powers, Malcolm, how much would be required in this Marshall Plan? Are we talking tens, hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars?
I couldn't say. I wouldn't pretend to know a budget figure, but a Marshall Plan that would prioritize building housing so it's affordable for people like you and me, housing for people who definitely need housing, so that when we say we're going to get people off the street, we can actually show them an option. There's an apartment or what have you that you can get into. A real concerted effort to address this level of poverty, I think, would really require the federal and state governments to work together and collaborate on something very big.
Malcolm, after 9/11, you spent some time out of the country in Afghanistan, other parts of the Middle East and Asia. It's become a cliche amongst Americans that the grime, the homelessness, the social suffering now in America is like places like Afghanistan or Pakistan. Is there any truth to that in your experience, having traveled the world extensively and also being an expert on homelessness in America?
I think it's very different. A lot of the poverty in third world countries has to do with class. I think it's kind of cliche to say we're becoming like a third world country. I think we're very different from the level of poverty in, say, a place like Pakistan or Afghanistan. The reasons for that poverty are very different for the reasons that are here. I think we shouldn't dwell on so much what we think we're becoming, but what we want to be, and then come up with solutions that would take us there.
Would it be fair to say, though, that the level of homelessness in the United States, certainly in places like San Francisco and San Diego, is much more extensive than in Kabul, in Afghanistan, or in large Pakistan?
Oh yeah, no, and certainly, people who come to this country. I've had Afghan colleagues who came here after Kabul fell, and their first comment to me was the homeless issue. They had never seen that kind of poverty before. They'd never seen just people left on the street like that. That was shocking to them.
Many people, particularly progressives, but others, would argue that if there was a Marshall Plan, it was misinvested in these crazy wars in the Middle East, and 2 wars in Iraq, wars in Afghanistan. Is there any truth to that, Malcolm? As America, it's not that America doesn't have the resources for another Marshall Plan, but those resources were wasted.
Well, certainly we can talk long about the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, what went wrong, and how money was wasted through a variety of avenues. But as long as we have candidates who want to cut taxes for, I'm going to sound like a cliche, but it's true, for the wealthiest among us, then certainly we have money to help the poorest among us. I don't think foreign policy necessarily will inhibit what we can do with social policy.
Malcolm, you, as I said earlier, you're the recipient of the Studs Terkel Prize for writing about the working classes. He is, of course, perhaps the most respected, influential social realist journalist of the 20th century. What do you think Terkel would think if he came back to life and saw the streets of San Francisco or San Diego or Los Angeles?
Oh, I think he'd be horrified. I think he'd get out there with his, what at the time was a tape recorder, and he'd start getting their stories to show that these are real human beings. They're not the stereotype, the one-dimensional figures that they're often presented to be. And he would, I think he would demand that we do something about it.
Do you think he'd be surprised?
I think he'd be surprised. I mean, intellectually, he might not be surprised in terms of his views of capitalism and the haves and have not, but I think he'd be surprised by the numbers and how it's swelled and how there wasn't a concerted effort to really try to address it once we saw the problem becoming a real problem.
Did everything change, do you think? This is the standard narrative. We've had many authors, writers on the show, Malcolm, who made this argument. Did everything change in the 80s with Reagan? Is it perhaps not uncoincidental that the neoliberal revolution began in California? The reaction against the the state and of New Deal ideals?
I think there's some truth to that. There are certainly things that Reagan did as governor that contributed to people being on the street, and I also think conservatives have been able to tap into the frustrations that people have, where it seems like all these, in their view, social programs aren't resolving anything. So there's been a backlash to situations that many people just don't understand.
Did you have, or do you have, models for your fiction? One, of course, thinks of John Steinbeck, the 20th century master of realism when it comes to the working class. Do you think Steinbeck did a good job? Were there other writers who influenced you? Other novelists?
Steinbeck did a good job. I mean, of course he did a good job. He has the Nobel Prize and a Pulitzer.
Another Californian, of course.
Right.
Educated of all places at Stanford.
That's right. Took him forever to graduate, but he did it. Really my influence, I read pretty much whatever comes my way. I don't have one particular author or authors who are influential. I read a lot of Southern writers because I like just how their descriptions are just so almost overwhelming. They really kind of capture atmosphere, and so I've been influenced by that in terms of my writing, both for fiction and nonfiction. But I don't have one particular author that I leaned on for this book.
A couple of weeks ago, we had the Scottish writer Andrew O'Hagan on the show. His new novel, Caledonian Road, is a kind of Dickensian treatment of not so much homelessness, but the griminess of life in London in the 2020s. Are there other international writers that you were indebted to, perhaps Dickens or other writers on critics, novelists, Zola perhaps, Dickens of the industrial world?
I've read Dickens, but I can't say that there's been a particular writer who's influenced my social writing. I've been really influenced or impressed by Ryszard Kapuscinski, the Polish reporter, just again by his writing and the richness of it, and I've tried to bring that to my own writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction.
A Pole in Africa, does it require an outsider, Malcolm, to do justice to a complicated subject?
I don't think it requires it. It's a different perspective, and I think it's a good perspective because they're seeing things as an outsider, as I did when I was in Afghanistan, as I did as a social service person who wasn't homeless. So it's a valuable perspective because it can show people who are sort of on the inside, who have experienced that, how others might be thinking of the subject. But it's not exclusive. I don't think it's better or worse. It's another perspective that's valuable.
You began, is it fair to say that you began as a social worker before you became a writer as well?
Right. No, I was social services.
Do you think that one can write about a problem like homelessness without going down into the street and being a social worker?
I think so. I mean, you don't have to be a social worker, but you can. I mean, it depends on the angle you're taking. But if you want to take it, if you're trying to write it from the perspective of a character who's homeless, then you'd have to get out there and do your research. I can't think of her name, but there's a Japanese writer who did that, and she wrote a novel about homeless people in Japan, and she spent years just interviewing homeless people so she could put this novel together. William Volman has written about...
Yeah, who liked your work, and Volman has been on our show and will be on again.
Oh, okay.
Who's based in Sacramento.
But he has certainly written about the Tenderloin and impoverished people, and I don't know exactly his background, but he doesn't write it from the perspective of someone who's been on the street who was homeless. But I think whatever you do, you have to immerse yourself in the subject so that you can really come across as knowledgeable and believable.
We had another writer on the show last year. We actually did a live event with him at Green Apple Books, whose uncle was homeless, and he essentially discovered it through his uncle and now has a non-profit focused on if not embracing homeless people, certainly recognizing their humanity, going up to them, for example, in the street and treating them as you or I would treat each other. Is that one way of going about this, of recognizing that homeless people are no more or less human than you or I?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one way to break the borders that are dividing us. Instead of walking around somebody who appears to be asleep on the sidewalk, as awkward as it might be, shake them on the shoulder. See, are you okay? If you see a homeless person on a regular basis when you go to work or something, take a minute and talk to them. Figure out who they are.
What should you say to them?
I'm sorry?
What should you say to them?
Introduce yourself, just like you and I would do if we met a stranger and we were told there's somebody you should meet. You just introduce yourself and say, hey, I'm so-and-so. I see you out here all the time. I want to introduce myself to you. I work down the street. How are you? It would be awkward. I don't pretend that it wouldn't be. But part of the awkwardness is you're breaking down barriers. Instead of being comfortable and saying, I'm going to walk around this person because I think they're a bum, I'm going to actually pause and try to figure out who this person is and get to know them. Put a little investment in this person. That would be awkward, and it's risky because then you might start feeling commitment to this person. You might develop affection for this person. You might actually begin to care that they're out on the street.
So it requires us to have some skin in the game.
I think so, yeah. It doesn't always have to be the big picture, what are the politicians are going to do. We can start very simply by just talking to people that we see on a regular basis who are on the street. It doesn't mean that we're going to get them off the street. It doesn't mean that's going to solve the housing crisis. But if it humanizes people, then I think there'll be more of an effort to address, the big needs. Because then, like you said, we'll have skin in the game. This isn't just some homeless guy. This is Fred, who I've gotten to know, and he came from Dallas originally, or whatever.
We'll get their story. You've used the term homeless to describe people living in tents on the street, perhaps drug addicts, alcoholics, as well as people living in their cars. That's a very broad way of thinking about it. Would you also include the homeless as people who are living with their parents or living with friends because they can't afford rent?
I would. I know people would disagree with me on that, and sometimes we get into these conversations. Is it, should we say homeless or unhoused? And I think frankly, who cares? Unhoused or homeless? Why are we wasting our time on that? Let's get them some help. Let's get them what they need. And the person who is staying with their parents or staying with a friend, we might not think of them as homeless, but if their friend says you got to go, or if the parents say you have to go, then they're homeless. So, lack of knowing that there's going to be a secure roof over your head, I think is certainly an aspect of homelessness.
What do you want people to learn from Out of the Rain, your new novel about homelessness in San Francisco?
Well, I hope they see the characters as real three-dimensional people. And that this will cause them to reflect on the homeless people they see in their daily lives. If the book has any impact, it would be nice if they, see somebody and then they think of a character in Out of the Rain and think, this person could be Walter, this person could be Katie, the woman I just read about in Out of the Rain. Just again, starting to break through those barriers that don't allow us to get to know people, because in many ways it's just easier to say they're this, put them in a box, and then I feel better when we just sweep them away.
Tell us about Katie Malcolm.
She's a staff person at Fresh Start, the agency in the book. She's a recovering alcoholic who's hanging on by the skin of her teeth, and she works with people who come into the shelter, and oftentimes she's disappointed because they straighten up for a minute, and then as is all too common with the disease of alcoholism and other drug addictions, they go back out on the street. And she sees herself in them quite a bit and knows that there's that she could end up doing the same thing if she's not careful.
It all sounds very sad, very concerning, but is there a fun side to being homeless? I mean, do homeless people, perhaps in the novel or in your experiences, do they have fun? Do they enjoy themselves?
Oh, yeah, I mean, they're people. I mean, they're three-dimensional people, just like all of us. We have our good days, we have our bad days. And they have lives. I mean, they're, again, like any of us, they're very entertaining. Get them talking about their lives. I mean, I've spent many enjoyable, and continue to spend enjoyable hours or afternoons just talking with people like I'm talking to you now. I mean, it's very enjoyable, and they have great stories like all of us do about their lives, and some of them are sad stories, and some of them are just hilariously funny. They're not aliens. They're just like us with their stories and their lives. They're different than us in that they're sleeping outside, but they're great people.
Finally, Malcolm, people are going to be watching this and hopefully thinking to themselves, I really want to try and help in some way. I'm busy, I don't have a lot of time, I've got many other things to address in my life. Is there one thing people could do?
Well, we've been talking about it. I think taking the time to talk to a homeless person you see on a regular basis for whatever reason is one way to go. Another way is to get involved with some of the agencies that are helping them. If you can't volunteer, go to the agencies and ask some of the questions that you're asking. Why are people out here? Why is your agency even needed? Just start educating yourself. Learn a little bit about the problem, and then take it from there. You don't have to go all Mother Teresa on the issue, but you can just see what moves you, and then follow that where you think you can take it.
So you didn't go all Mother Teresa in this book?
In what way?
Well, I don't know what you meant by go all Mother Teresa.
What I meant was that you don't have to suddenly go 100%. I'm going to be working with homeless people and devoting all of my life to poverty.
That was, of course, the original question.
To poverty issues. But you can explore it. You can learn about the issue, and as you learn about it, as you gradually begin to feel you're coming to grips with some aspects of it, follow that knowledge where it will take you. Maybe it won't take you anywhere. Maybe you'll just have that knowledge and you're satisfied with that you understand it better. Maybe it'll lead you to donate to agencies, to volunteer, to whatever. But I think the first step is humanizing the people we see, and then learning about it from their perspective, and taking that knowledge where you think it will lead you.
Is this the beginning of a fictional career, Malcolm? Or might you go back to nonfiction after this novel?
Oh, I'll go back to nonfiction. I don't know if this is the beginning of the fictional career. It felt like the right book to do at this time, and I did it. And if another novel idea comes to me that I think is worth pursuing, I'll pursue that.
Well, J. Malcolm Garcia, author of a new novel, Out in the Rain, a man who knows homelessness community all too well as a social worker. Congratulations on the new book.
Thanks very much.
And we'll get you back on the show, maybe with your new nonfiction. Thank you so much.
Thank you.